In the summer of 1941, German tank crews fired shell after shell at a single Soviet machine sitting in the middle of a Lithuanian road. The rounds struck home, and then they bounced off. Sparks flew, paint chipped, steel rang like a struck bell, and the monster just sat there untouched, its long gun swinging toward them. This had never happened before. The German army had rolled over Poland, over France, over half of Europe, and nothing on a battlefield had ever simply ignored their guns. Now, 3 days into the largest invasion in human history, a lone tank was eating everything they threw at it and refusing to die. The crews called it the Russian monster. Their reports used the word fear, which is not a word German panzer crews wrote down lightly. For a few terrible months in 1941, Adolf Hitler's tank divisions met a steel beast they could not stop, and the whole blitzkrieg shuddered. This is the story of the KV heavy tank, the slow, ugly, badly built giant that broke down more than it fought, and still managed to humiliate the finest army in the world. To understand why this tank caused so much panic, you have to picture what a German tank crew expected in 1941. They expected to win. They had every reason to. By that summer, the German Panzer arm was the most feared force on earth. Their tanks were not the heaviest, but their crews were the best trained, their tactics the sharpest, their coordination between tanks, aircraft and infantry years ahead of everyone else. When they drove east into the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, they brought roughly 3,000 tanks and a belief that the Red Army would shatter in weeks. And at first it did. Soviet units were caught half asleep. Whole armies were surrounded. Airfields were wiped out before the planes could take off. The roads east filled with retreating men and burning vehicles. It looked exactly like France all over again, just on a bigger map. But scattered along that front were a handful of machines the Germans had never seen in combat. Not many. Maybe 500 of them across the entire Soviet line, with some counts running a little higher, towards 600. They were called KV tanks, named after Kliment Voroshilov, an old Soviet marshal whose name got stamped onto the heaviest thing the Red Army owned, and the first German crew to meet one in the open would not forget it. The KV was a brute. It weighed somewhere around 45 to 47 tons, which made it far heavier than anything the Germans were driving. A German Panzer III of that year weighed barely half as much. When one of these things rolled onto a wooden bridge, the bridge often had a vote, and the vote was usually no. The sheer mass of the tank was a fact the crews carried with them everywhere they went. Its armour was the whole point. The front plate and the turret carried about 3 inches of steel, and in places the hull ran from 1.5 inches up to that same 3 inches. 3 inches does not sound like much until you understand what was being fired at it. The standard German anti-tank gun in 1941 was a 37mm weapon, a neat little gun on 2 wheels that a few men could push around. Against Polish and French tanks it had worked just fine. Against the KV it was a joke. The crews started calling their own gun the door knocker, because firing it at one of these tanks did about as much as knocking politely on a steel door and waiting to be let in. The shells hit the armour and skipped off into the grass. Worse than useless, the muzzle flash gave the gun crew's hiding spot away. So a man could fire, miss in the sense that nothing happened, and then watch that long Soviet gun swing toward the little puff of smoke he had just made. Firing the door knocker at a KV was close to raising your hand and asking to be noticed. So the Germans brought up the next gun, the 50mm, bigger, heavier, a real anti-tank weapon, and at normal combat range, it failed too. The rounds cracked against that thick plate and did nothing. To get even a chance of a penetration, the gunners had to let the tank come in dangerously close, far closer than any sane crew wanted a 47-ton monster to get, and even then, the hits often just gouged the surface and skated away. The whole German anti-tank doctrine had been built around stopping a tank before it could close the distance. The KV simply walked through the killing zone and kept coming. One German battle report from those days put it in plain, almost helpless language. It said that half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at the tank without any noticeable effect. Read that again. Half a dozen guns, no noticeable effect. That is a unit watching its main weapon turn into noise. Inside the KV sat a crew of 5 men in a hull about 20 feet long. Their main gun was a 76.2mm cannon. The earliest tanks carried a version called the L11. Then came the F-32, and the 1941 turrets mounted the F-34, sometimes called the ZS-5. Whatever the model, that gun could reach out and kill any German tank on the field, long before the German tank could answer back. This was the part the panzer crews could not get around. It was not just that their shells bounced off the KV. It was that the KV's shells did not bounce off them. The fight was lopsided in both directions at once. The Soviet tank could kill at a range where the German tank was still helplessly closing in, hoping to find a magic angle that did not exist. The engine was a diesel, a 600 horsepower V2K, 12 cylinders arranged in a V. That choice mattered more than it sounds. Most German tanks ran on gasoline, which catches fire fast when a tank is hit. Diesel is far harder to set alight. So even on the rare moment a German round found a weak spot, the KV was less likely to brew up into a fireball than the tanks shooting at it. A German crew that finally landed a clean hit could watch their reward be a tank that shrugged, smoked a little and kept turning its turret. What it gained in armor and firepower, it gave back in speed. The KV crawled. Its top speed was only about 19 to 22 miles per hour on a good surface and far less across broken ground. It was a slow, heavy, deliberate machine. And buried inside it was a flaw that nobody on the German side could see yet, a weakness in the guts of the tank that would end up killing more KVs than every German gun combined. But that part of the story comes later. For now, on the battlefield, all the Germans knew was that a slow tank nothing could kill is still a very large problem, and they were about to learn exactly how large. The lesson came near a town in Lithuania called Raseiniai. It was the 23rd of June, 1941, the second full day of the invasion. The German 6th Panzer Division, part of the drive north toward Leningrad, was pushing hard through the Baltic countryside. Speed was everything. Their whole way of war depended on moving faster than the enemy could think. A division that stops moving stops being dangerous, and these men knew it. And then one Soviet tank parked itself across their lifeline. It rolled up behind the German advance, onto a road that crossed soft, marshy ground, and it stopped. Behind it sat the supply trucks, the fuel, the ammunition, the things a fast-moving division needs to keep moving. In front of it, the road ran back to the rest of the 6th Panzer. By sitting exactly there, one tank cut a powerful German division in half. The forward units that had already pushed across were suddenly on their own, with the river of fuel and shells behind them choked off by a single machine they could not move. And here is what made the spot so deadly. The marshy ground on either side of the road did the tanks defending for it. Nothing heavy could leave the roadway without bogging down in the soft earth, so the Germans could not simply drive around the obstacle and ignore it. They had to deal with it head-on ground the tank had effectively chosen, where their numbers counted for far less than they should have. Now, a quick word of honesty, because the history matters. This particular tank is usually remembered as a KV-2, the monster version of the family, built on the same hull but carrying a gigantic 152mm howitzer in a turret the size of a small room. Some accounts, including the German commander's own later writing, called it a KV-1. The records are mixed, and historians still argue about it. What is not in doubt is that it was a tank of the KV family, the same breed of armoured beast, with the same impossible armour, doing exactly what made these machines legendary. The Germans sent men to deal with it. They brought up 450mm anti-tank guns, the same weapon that had already failed elsewhere, and they set them up close, hidden in the trees beside the road where they thought they had the angle. They opened fire. The KV turned its turret and destroyed all 4 guns, along with the crews serving them. The German shells, meanwhile, did nothing the tank's crew seemed to even notice. A whole battery of anti-tank guns, the kind of force that was supposed to stop a tank cold, was wiped off the map by the very thing it was sent to kill, and it never even scratched its target. So the Germans reached for the one weapon that could actually do the job, the 88mm. This was their famous anti-aircraft gun, a tall, heavy weapon designed to shoot down planes miles overhead, and it fired a shell big enough to crack the KV's armor. But that gun was a beast to handle on the ground. It stood tall, it was hard to hide, and it needed a crew working in the open to wheel it into place. They began dragging one into position, about 800 yards behind the tank, sweating it forward foot by foot, hoping to hit it from the rear, where it was looking the wrong way. The KV crew saw it. Before the 88 could land a single telling hit, the tank's gun spoke and knocked the weapon out. Think about that for a moment. The Germans finally found the one gun on the whole battlefield that could kill this thing, and the tank killed the gun first. One machine, 5 or 6 men inside it, against a division with every weapon it owned. That tank held the crossroads for the better part of a day, stretching into a second. For the Germans, who measured the whole campaign in how many miles they could cover before dark, losing a day to a single vehicle was almost unthinkable. The advance toward Leningrad sat and waited on one stubborn tank, while behind it the schedule that the entire invasion depended on began to slip. In the end, it took a trick to finish it. The Germans brought up another 88 and used their light tanks to dance around in front of the KV, drawing its attention, making it swing its turret one way while the big gun was wheeled into place behind it. Firing from the rear, they finally landed hits that pierced the armor. Even then, the turret kept moving, so German combat engineers crept up to the disabled tank and dropped grenades through the holes the shells had punched. It took a coordinated effort, planes of distraction, a heavy gun, and men crawling up to it with explosives, to do what a whole battery of anti-tank guns could not. The crew fought to the very end. And here is the part that says everything. The German soldiers who killed those men were so impressed by what that one crew had done that they buried them with honors, right there by the road. Years later, in the 1960s, the remains were dug up and reburied in a proper Soviet cemetery. Enemies do not bury you with honors for losing. They do it for terrifying them. That was one tank. The Red Army had hundreds. Up and down the front in those first weeks, the same scene kept repeating. A German column would meet a KV, pour fire into it and watch the shells bounce. Their reports filled with the same shocked language. The thing could not be stopped by normal means. You needed the 88, or you needed combat engineers crawling up to it with explosives, or you needed to wait for it to break down on its own. None of those were the clean, fast tank kills the Blitzkrieg was built on. Every one of them cost time, and time was the one thing the German plan could not spare. If you are getting a sense of just how lopsided these fights could be, the next story is the one that ended up in the record books. By August of 1941, the German drive on Leningrad was grinding north through the approaches to the city. 3 panzer divisions, the 8th, the 6th, and the 1st, were pushing toward a town called Krasnovardisk, today called Gatchina. It was a key road junction on the way to Leningrad, and whoever held it controlled the advance. Standing in the way was a Soviet officer named Zinovy Kolobanov, a senior lieutenant, commanding a platoon of just 5 KV-1 tanks. 5 tanks. Against the spearhead of 3 divisions. On paper, that is not a battle. That is a delaying action that ends with 5 burning Soviet tanks, and a German column rolling on by lunchtime. Kolobanov did not read the paper. He looked at the ground instead. He found a place where the road ran along a narrow strip of solid earth between patches of swamp. On either side, the marsh was too soft for tanks. Any German column coming through would be funneled into a single line, nose to tail, unable to spread out, unable to maneuver, with soft ground trapping them on both flanks. It was a choke point, the same kind of natural trap that had worked at Raseiniai, except this time a Soviet commander chose it on purpose and planned the whole fight around it. He spread his 5 tanks to cover the different roads into the junction and dug his own in around the worst pinch in the line, hidden, hull down, with only the turret showing waiting. He even thought about the math of the ambush. Packed nose to tail on that causeway, a German column would have nowhere to go once the front and the back were plugged. Cork both ends, and everything in between is just targets sitting in a line. That was the plan before the first German engine was even heard. On the 20th of August, the German armour came. Kolobanov let the lead tanks roll deep into the trap before anyone fired. This took nerve. He sat in a hidden tank and watched enemy armor drive past his position closer and closer, holding his fire while every instinct screamed to shoot. Then his gunner, a man named Andrei Yusov, put a round into the very first tank in the column. It burst into flame and stopped dead, corking the road. Here is the detail that turned a fight into a slaughter. The Germans did not realize they were being ambushed. They saw the lead tank explode and assumed it had hit a mine. So the column stopped. They sat there on the narrow road, packed in tight, looking for the minefield that did not exist, while a single hidden KV picked them apart. That wrong guess cost them everything. A column that knows it is being shot at scatters and shoots back. A column that thinks it drove into a minefield freezes and waits for engineers to clear a path. The Germans froze. Yusov shifted his aim to the last tank in the column and killed that one too. Now the Germans were trapped exactly as Kolobanov had drawn it up. The lead was burning, the rear was burning, the swamp held both sides, and there was nowhere to go. One by one, methodically, working from the ends toward the middle, Kolobanov's tank chewed through the column trapped in between. The Germans figured out where the fire was coming from and shot back with everything they had. Their shells hammered into Kolobanov's KV again and again. The crew could hear the rounds slamming into the armor like a blacksmith going to work on the outside of the hull, a constant ringing that never stopped. By the end of the fight, that single tank had been struck more than 135 times. Not one round punched through. The crew kept firing the whole time, loading and aiming through the noise of 135 impacts that should have killed them, and never did. When it was over, Kolobanov's tank alone had destroyed 22 German tanks in a single engagement. His gunner had fired around 98 rounds to do it, feeding shell after shell into that gun until the count climbed past 20, and the rest of his platoon, the other 4 KV-1s covering the other roads, brought the total to 43 German tanks destroyed that day. 22 kills from one tank. The Guinness Records people would later call it one of the most successful single-tank actions in the history of warfare. And it happened because a Soviet officer understood that a tank nothing could kill, parked in exactly the right spot, was worth more than a whole division of tanks in the open. So if the KV was this unstoppable, you might be wondering why the Germans were not simply driven back into the sea in 1941. Why didn't 500 invincible tanks just win the war? The answer is the dark twist in this whole story. The KV's greatest enemy was not the German army, it was itself. For all its thick armor and its big gun, the KV was, mechanically, a deeply troubled machine. The worst part was the transmission, the set of gears that turns engine power into movement. The design was old, based on a Holt Caterpillar pattern that was already something like 20 years out of date. A tractor lineage that had never been meant to drag 47 tons of armoured steel through mud. It simply could not handle the strain. The gears ground, slipped and jammed, and a driver who needed to change gear in a hurry, which in combat is always, might find the lever fighting him every inch of the way. Drivers hated it. The story passed around the Soviet tank crews was that to force the KV into gear, a driver sometimes needed a hammer sitting beside him in the hull to physically beat the gear lever into place. Picture that for a second. A crew is in a firefight, shells are bouncing off the hull, the gunner is working, and the driver is swinging a hammer at his own controls just to make the tank move. Whether that was every tank or just the worst of them, the point stands. Shifting gears in this thing was a fight all by itself, a second battle going on inside the hull, while the first one raged outside. And the engines wore out fast. A KV engine in 1941 might last only somewhere between 80 and 200 hours of running before it was finished. That is not much. A long road march could use up a serious chunk of an engine's entire life, which meant a tank could arrive at the battlefield with its heart already half worn out, having fought nothing but the distance it travelled to get there. Put those two facts together, and you get the bitter truth of 1941. More KV tanks were lost to their own breakdowns than to German guns. They threw their tracks. They seized their gears. They ran out of fuel on roads that no supply truck could reach, because the supply system behind them had collapsed in the chaos of the retreat. And when a KV broke down in territory the Germans were about to overrun, the crew had no way to recover that 47-ton giant. There was no recovery vehicle strong enough nearby, no time, and the enemy was coming. So they did the only thing they could. They blew it up, or they walked away and left it. Tank after tank that no German gun could kill was simply abandoned at the side of a road, a perfect armoured fortress betrayed by a gearbox and an empty tank. It is one of the great what-ifs of the war. A tank that the German army could barely scratch, lost again and again, not to enemy fire but to a bad gearbox and an empty fuel tank. If the KV had been as reliable as it was tough, the opening months in the east might have looked very different. These tanks were built at the Kirov plant in Leningrad, the same city the Germans were racing to capture. Through 1941 the plant turned out close to 1,400 of them, working under worsening conditions as the front crept closer. Think about the strangeness of that. The factory building the tank was inside the very prize. The German army was driving toward, churning out heavy tanks, while the sound of the front grew louder every week. As the siege tightened, the work could not stay there. In October, with German guns almost in range, the whole operation was torn up and shipped east, machine tools, blueprints, skilled workers and all, to the city of Chelyabinsk, deep behind the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of any German tank. They hauled an entire tank factory across a continent in the middle of a war. At Chelyabinsk the work went on, the lines were rebuilt, and the giant kept coming off the assembly floor, in a place no panzer would ever reach. The Germans took ground, but they never took the factory that mattered. But the deepest mark the KV left was not on a battlefield, and it was not on a factory floor. It was in the minds of the German High Command. When reports of these tanks and their cousins, the famous T-34, reached the top, they caused something close to alarm. Here was the most confident army in the world, admitting that the enemy was fielding tanks better protected than their own, and that their standard guns could not deal with them. The General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg itself, pushed for a formal inquiry into what the Germans were running into in the east. When men like that start demanding investigations into the enemy's hardware, the shock has gone all the way to the bone. That realization gnawed at German designers. They studied the Soviet machines and took hard notes on what made them so dangerous. The thick, well-angled armor, the wide tracks that floated over mud that swallowed German tanks, the long, hard-hitting gun. The shock of meeting Soviet armor that shrugged off their shells fed directly into the German push to build heavier, better protected tanks of their own, with sloped armor and bigger guns, the machines that would appear later in the war as the Panther and the Tiger. You can draw a straight line from a KV sitting in a Lithuanian road to the drawing boards where Germany's most famous tanks were designed. In other words, the KV did not just block roads and kill tank columns. It forced the German army to redesign its entire idea of what a tank should be. The monster on the road in 1941 changed the tanks that came after it, including the very ones built to hunt it down. So picture that lone tank one more time. The one sitting in the road near Raseiniai, with German shells skipping off its hide, and 4 wrecked anti-tank guns smoking in front of it. It was slow. It was clumsy. Its gearbox was a nightmare, and its engine was living on borrowed time. By every measure of polish and craftsmanship, the German machines hunting it were finer pieces of engineering. And none of that mattered, because for one long day, nothing those finer machines carried could kill it. That is the strange genius of the KV. It was never the best tank of the war,